So we've been talking about how similes and metaphors and other types of figurative language are intended to help a writer convey an emotion or an idea. And we're going to see that today in the poem Harlem by Langston Hughes. Let's take a look at a very famous proverb first as we learn the word deferred. And deferred means to put off or to postpone. And I think right now we can all connect to that. There are a lot of things that we would like, but we can't have right now because of this coronavirus quarantine. So think about some of those emotions that you might be feeling as we're reading this proverb in the poem. So the proverb says, "Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a dream fulfilled is a tree of life." Let's take a look at that second half especially. Is it a simile or a metaphor? A dream fulfilled is a tree of life. Comparing a dream fulfilled to a tree of life without using like, as, or than. If you said a metaphor, you're right. And this is the type of idea that Langston Hughes is trying to convey in his poem. And Langston Hughes is a very famous African American poet, and he wrote this in 1951. So this was prior to the civil rights movement. And he felt like African Americans weren't being treated fairly. And so there were a lot of things that he wanted, but he couldn't have because they were being treated so unfairly. So let's take a look at the poem. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? So let's take a look first at all of these comparisons. Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Is that a simile or a metaphor? Or fester like a sore and then run? Is that a simile or a metaphor? Does it stink like rotten meat? Simile or metaphor? Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Simile or metaphor? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load? Simile or metaphor? Or does it explode? Simile or metaphor? And if you said simile for most of these, you're right. Most of these stanzas here are similes. And then all of a sudden he switches gears in this very last stanza, or does it explode? And now all of a sudden we have a metaphor. So let's think about what he's trying to convey with those ideas. Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? So think about something that's alive, like a grape, that then gets shriveled up into something lifeless. Or fester like a sore and then run. And you might need to know what the word fester is, and this is a little disgusting, but it means to form pus, to ooze. If you've ever seen an infected sore, it's really, really disgusting, and it becomes rotten and sometimes stinky. Does it stink like rotten meat? Maybe you've smelled something that's rotten and disgusting. Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet, something that should be good, but it's not. All of a sudden it's wasteful and it's not useful anymore. Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. What kind of emotion do you think we have connected to a heavy load? Picture a person who's just weighed down by something. Or does it explode? What kind of emotion do you think he's trying to convey with does it explode? And a lot of times we think about people who are very angry, sometimes their anger explodes into a temper. And notice though, he had all of these similes, and then all of a sudden he changed his writing right here. Do you notice how it's written differently? It's italicized. Why do we italicize things? We want them to stand out to our reader. So it's kind of interesting that he has simile, 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 and then all of a sudden in a stanza by itself, it's italicized on that line by itself, or does it explode? So maybe he's really trying to convey that idea of anger. That emotion seems to be one of the strongest ones. And in our book, Love That Dog, Jack is starting to notice how poems are formed and what they look like. The lining, the stanzas, the spacing, and he's starting to talk to his teacher about that. And tomorrow we're going to go into lining a little bit more, but let's take a look at what Langston Hughes has done in his poem. You might have noticed that this top line, they're not called sentences in a poem, they're called lines. This top line is all by itself and it's not indented like the rest of the poem. We've got a big idea. The whole thing is about what happens to a dream deferred. And then he has a whole bunch of similes right in a row in the same stanza. It's not called a paragraph, it's called a stanza. But then he has a break. Like maybe he wants us to notice this one separated, sagging like a heavy load, that sadness, that depression. And then here at the end, on a line all by itself, so it's a stanza all by itself, or does it explode? Kind of that idea of anger. So the last thing that you're going to do today is to take a quizzes, and we're going to practice some of the similes and metaphors in that. And then I'm going to ask you some questions about Harlem. So if you need to rewatch this video, you're welcome to do that. And when you're finished with the quizzes, don't forget to mark it as complete in the Wednesday assignment. Have a great day.